The moment Keanu Reeves stepped onto that live TV show, it was supposed to be a routine appearance. He'd been on countless shows before, his usual calm demeanor and easygoing responses always making him the fan favorite. But tonight was different. The air in the studio felt thicker, like there was something brewing beneath the surface, something no one could quite name, and the moment Keanu entered, everyone felt it. The hosts were excited, anticipating that they'd finally get him to speak out on something controversial. The conservative pundits, who had shown up for the same event, were ready with their jabs, their smirks plastered on their faces. The audience was buzzing, preparing for the political fireworks they assumed were about to take place. But what no one knew was that Keanu had had enough. The host, a sharp-tongued liberal, grinned from ear to ear as Keanu took his seat, making small talk about his latest film. Then, with a calculated pause, the host turned to Keanu with that signature, almost condescending smile. "So, Keanu," the host began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "you've always been one of the good ones. But what do you say to people who criticize you for being, well, so silent on the political stage? Aren't you just another actor, playing it safe, staying quiet while the world falls apart?" Keanu didn't flinch. The studio went quiet, the audience unsure of how he'd respond. Some might have expected him to shift uncomfortably in his seat, or give a rehearsed answer. But instead, Keanu looked the host straight in the eyes, his voice calm but carrying an unexpected weight. "You want me to take a side, right?" he said, his tone almost too soft at first, but everyone could hear the sharpness behind it. "You want me to either condemn people or praise them based on what? The latest trending hashtag?" He glanced at the liberal pundits sitting next to him, their smiles now faltering just slightly, the tension rising. "But here's the thing, you all sit there, all of you, pointing fingers. You act like you know the answers, like you're standing on some moral high ground. But all I see is a bunch of people, with their own agendas, using the same broken system to divide the rest of us." The host's face tightened for a second, clearly caught off guard. He quickly recovered, the audience still on edge, unsure whether they were witnessing a breakdown or a brilliant move. "So, you're saying you're above it all? That you don't have a responsibility to speak out?" The host shot back, his tone rising, hoping to make Keanu flinch. "No," Keanu replied slowly, his eyes unwavering. "I'm saying that you're more interested in being right than in actually solving problems." He leaned forward, his gaze now turning to the cameras, his voice louder, deliberate. "Everyone here is obsessed with being on the right side of things. But when we're busy choosing sides, we forget about the people in the middle who don't even have a voice. They're just trying to survive. You think the world's changed because you've got a Twitter account or a platform on TV. You're just playing the same game, but with a different name." The audience went dead silent. There was no applause, no immediate reactions. You could feel the weight of Keanu's words sinking in, hitting harder than anyone anticipated. The host, now visibly rattled, opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time that night, nothing came out. The silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable, as Keanu's gaze remained steady on him, his eyes revealing nothing but quiet certainty. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the one they needed. And in that moment, the entire studio seemed to understand. Keanu wasn't just an actor anymore. He was something else, something that no one could easily label, no matter how much they tried. The room was heavy with silence, but Keanu could feel the tension rising. The host, now visibly flustered, tried to regain control of the conversation, but his voice cracked slightly as he spoke again. "You've got this whole, above it all, attitude, don't you, Keanu?" He chuckled, but it was forced, not the smooth, calculated laugh he'd been using throughout the show. "You think you're too good for us, too good for this conversation, don't you? You're sitting here with all of us, talking like you're the voice of reason, but you don't think you should ever pick a side? How convenient." Keanu didn't react, just let the words float into the air and settle. The other panelists, conservative pundits now smiling smugly, leaned forward in their seats, sensing an opening. They hadn't been getting much attention so far, but now they saw the chance to turn the tide, to take Keanu down a peg, to expose him for what they believed was hypocrisy. One of them, a middle-aged man with a sharp jawline and a perfectly pressed suit, smirked. "You know, Keanu, for someone who pretends to be so enlightened, it's almost laughable how you avoid the real issues. I mean, you make millions off a film industry that profits from all the things you claim to despise. You fly around in private jets, wear expensive clothes, all while saying you're just like everyone else. The truth is, you're not. You're as much a part of the problem as the rest of us." The man's words hung in the air, dripping with disdain. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, as if he had just delivered the knockout punch. The audience began to murmur, unsure of how to react, unsure of whether Keanu would buckle under the pressure. Keanu's gaze shifted from the host to the man who'd just spoken. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. The crowd fell into an uneasy hush, awaiting Keanu's response, expecting him to offer some apology or justification, perhaps a self-aware laugh at his own contradictions. But instead, Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and steady, though there was an edge to it that had not been there before. "Let me get this straight," he said, his words slow but deliberate. "You think that because I've made money, I'm automatically part of the problem? You think the fact that I've had some success means I'm no different than the people who run the system you claim to despise?" He paused, watching the man's expression shift from smugness to something a little more uncertain. "I don't sit here and pretend I'm perfect. I'm not. But I've never claimed to be either. I've always been open about who I am, about where I come from, and how I choose to live my life." The man shifted in his chair, his arms uncrossing, clearly uncomfortable, but Keanu wasn't finished. "What's ironic," Keanu continued, "is that you think you're fighting the system by pointing fingers at me or anyone else who's made it. But what you don't realize is that you're doing the same thing you accuse everyone else of doing. You're creating division where none needs to exist, building walls that separate people who should be working together. You don't want to fix the problem, you just want to be seen as right. You're not looking for solutions, you're just looking for someone to blame." The room was quiet now, the air thick with the realization that Keanu wasn't backing down. The host, who had been trying to control the narrative with his snide remarks, suddenly seemed smaller, less in control than he had moments ago. The other pundits, once eager to dive in and score points, now hesitated, unsure of how to respond to someone who wasn't falling for the trap they'd laid out. Keanu's eyes moved slowly around the room, almost as if he were taking in the faces of everyone present. His voice softened, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "I'm not saying I'm above anyone. But I've never been afraid to ask questions, to challenge the narrative. I've never been afraid to walk away from the things that don't align with my values. And if you think I'm above it all because I choose to do that, then maybe you need to ask yourself why you've spent so much of your life letting the system tell you what's right and wrong. Maybe you should ask why you've spent your time tearing people down instead of building them up." The words landed like a punch. It was clear now, Keanu wasn't going to play by their rules. He wasn't going to be the token celebrity they could use to push their agenda. He wasn't the puppet they thought he was. And he wasn't about to let them dictate how the conversation went. There was a shift in the energy of the room. The audience, who had been ready to watch a predictable argument unfold, began to sense that something was happening that they hadn't anticipated. The conservative pundits, who had been ready to tag team Keanu, now sat back, unsure of how to move forward. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and an almost predatory look, finally broke the silence. "You can sit here and act like you're some kind of martyr, Keanu," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "but at the end of the day, you're still just a rich actor who plays pretend for a living. You're not some political savior. So stop acting like you've got the answers." Keanu's response came quickly, his tone no longer calm, but sharp, cutting through her words like a blade. "I never said I was a savior. I'm just a man who's tired of watching people get used as pawns in a game they don't even realize they're playing. You don't need to be a savior to call out the bullshit, and you don't need to be rich to do it. You just need to have the guts to speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient." The woman scoffed, clearly frustrated by his refusal to follow the script she had in mind. But Keanu wasn't done yet. "You think I'm rich and out of touch because I made money doing what I love. But you don't understand what it takes to get to this point. You think my success means I don't care about people, but you have no idea how many times I've worked to give back, how many projects I've funded that actually help people. I don't talk about it because it's not about the spotlight for me. It's about the impact." The studio had never been this tense. The host, clearly rattled by Keanu's sudden turn, tried to steer the conversation back on track. "I think we've had enough of your self-righteous sermon for tonight, Keanu," he said, his words dripping with frustration. "Let's move on to something else, shall we?" But Keanu wasn't about to let them control the narrative. "I'm not here to be your punching bag, or to let you use me as a tool for your agenda," he said, his voice steady but firm. "If that's all this show is about, then maybe I should walk off this stage right now. Because I'm not interested in playing the game you want me to play." The room was thick with tension, so much so that even the cameramen seemed hesitant to adjust their lenses. It was as if the entire studio held its breath, unsure of what would come next. The host, flustered and unable to regain control, glanced nervously at the other panelists, who now sat with varying expressions of disbelief, confusion, and even a hint of respect toward Keanu, but none of them dared to speak. The conservative pundits, who had been eagerly waiting to pile on, now appeared to be searching for an opening that might allow them to salvage their positions. But Keanu, with an almost unsettling calm, was unmoved by their scrutiny. It was the woman, the one who had tried to mock him earlier, who finally spoke. Her voice, though still sharp, now held an edge of frustration as she leaned forward in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly. "So what exactly are you saying, Keanu?" she asked, her tone a little too brittle for comfort. "You're not here to play the game, yet you still agreed to come on this show. Don't you see that you're just as much a part of this circus as anyone else? You can sit there and try to preach to us about how you're above it all, but at the end of the day, you're just another actor trying to sell yourself to the public. You're no different from the rest of us." Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't seem bothered by her words, but there was something in his eyes now, something more intense, almost as if he were looking straight through her. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping slowly on the armrest, a gesture that somehow made the room feel even quieter. "You're right," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not different. I'm just like everyone else. I'm a person who has the same struggles, the same doubts, the same questions as everyone else. The only difference is that my struggles play out on a much bigger stage. But that doesn't mean I have all the answers. It just means that I have a platform to speak, and I choose to use it when I can, but not to feed into your games." The woman's face tightened, her mouth opening as though she was about to speak again, but she paused, realizing that Keanu wasn't going to give her the soundbite she was looking for. The tension in the room continued to build, and the audience, who had once been cheering and jeering on cue, now sat in an almost uncomfortable silence. The host, sensing his grip on the situation slipping further, tried to redirect the conversation, but his attempts only served to make things worse. So, the host interjected, his voice a bit shakier now. "Let's move on. You've made your point. You're not here to play politics, we get it. But here's the thing, Keanu. People listen to you. They admire you. And when you don't speak up, when you don't take a side, it's like you're giving a free pass to those who use their power for the wrong reasons. You're essentially saying that none of it matters." Keanu's expression didn't change. His eyes remained steady, unwavering. "I'm not saying none of it matters, but I'm not going to play into a game where it's all about which side you pick. I don't care which side you're on if the end result is just more division, more hatred. I've seen enough of it. I've been to places where people are literally dying because of decisions made by people who think they have all the answers. People who think they know better because they're in power. It's not about sides. It's about people. The ones who don't have a voice. The ones who don't get to sit at tables like this and argue over who's right and who's wrong." The host, his face now reddening with the pressure, opened his mouth again, but Keanu raised his hand slightly, signaling for him to pause. He wasn't done yet, and for the first time, everyone could sense it. The words Keanu was about to say weren't meant to score political points or to make people feel good about themselves. They weren't meant to make anyone comfortable. "I've spent a lot of time in this industry," Keanu continued, his voice growing a little stronger, "and I've seen how it works. I've seen how people use their platforms, their fame, to push their own agendas, whether it's political, personal, or just to sell something. But that's not what I want to do. I've never used my platform to make anyone feel small or to divide people. I've always tried to use it to bring attention to things that matter, to causes that actually make a difference in people's lives. But I don't come here to make people feel comfortable, and I'm not here to feed into whatever narrative you want to build. So if that means I'm not on your side, fine. But at least I'm being honest." There was a brief pause as the host, the pundits, and the audience all took in Keanu's words. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that Keanu had exposed them, it was that he had exposed a truth that none of them were ready to face. The system, the one they had all been a part of, was broken, and they were too entrenched in it to see it. Finally, one of the conservative pundits, the middle-aged man who had been so eager to challenge Keanu earlier, spoke up again. This time, his voice was softer, a little more hesitant, as if he were genuinely trying to understand. "So, you're saying that all of us here are just part of the problem? That we're just feeding into this never-ending cycle?" Keanu didn't look at him right away. He took a moment, letting the silence stretch for a few seconds before answering. "I'm saying that the system is broken, yes. But I'm not pointing fingers at anyone here. I'm not saying you're bad people. I'm just saying that if we keep playing this game, if we keep focusing on who's right and who's wrong, we're never going to fix the real problems. We're just going to keep going in circles." He paused again, his eyes moving slowly across the room. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of the circles. I'm tired of hearing people talk about the same things over and over again without ever really trying to change anything. The audience remained still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The host, now visibly sweating under the pressure, looked like he was about to explode with frustration. But something had shifted. Keanu had managed to do what no one else had been able to do. He had made them all stop and think. In a room full of people who thrived on division, who lived for conflict, Keanu had forced them to question whether the fight they were so eager to engage in was really worth it at all. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, no one knew how to move forward. Keanu, however, was done. He had said what he needed to say. He had spoken his truth, and whether the others wanted to hear it or not, he knew that he couldn't and wouldn't play along any longer. The tension in the studio was unbearable. It felt as if every second stretched into an eternity. Keanu sat in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his presence in the room felt like an immovable force. The host, looking more disoriented by the minute, shifted nervously, trying to regroup but unable to recover the control he had once had over the conversation. He had expected Keanu to be just another pawn in his televised political circus, a celebrity to stand on one side of the debate and fuel the fire. Instead, Keanu had done the unthinkable. He had completely thrown off the script. The conservative pundit who had been so eager to challenge Keanu earlier now looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. He cleared his throat before speaking again, trying to regain the ground he'd lost. So, let me get this straight, the man began, his voice quieter now. You don't want to pick a side, but you think everyone else is to blame for the division? You've made your fortune. You've lived in the lap of luxury. You don't get to sit here and tell me I'm part of the problem when you've been complicit in the same system all along. Keanu's eyes remained locked on him, unwavering, as he leaned forward, his voice steady. You think that because I've been successful, that makes me the same as the people who exploit others? His tone was even, but there was a sharpness there that made the man pause. You think I don't see the flaws in the system? You think I haven't had to navigate that same system to get here? I'm not blind to it, but here's the thing. I'm not running from it either. I'm trying to live in a way that makes sense, that actually does some good. And if that means stepping away from your narrative, then fine. But don't tell me I'm complicit because I haven't played the game your way. The conservative pundit, now visibly rattled, opened his mouth to respond, but Keanu wasn't done. He leaned in, his words hitting hard. You keep saying we need to pick a side, but what you don't get is that I'm not playing your game. I'm not going to pick a side just to make you feel better, to make your narrative easier to swallow. I'm not here for your applause. I'm here because I believe that the truth is more important than whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're rich or poor, or whether you agree with me or not. The room had gone deathly silent. The host, who had been the one to set this whole thing in motion, was now sitting rigid in his chair, his face flushed with frustration. He had expected Keanu to crumble under the pressure, to give a soundbite they could use to fuel their own agenda. But instead, Keanu had turned the tables, forcing the host to confront his own hypocrisy in front of millions of viewers. The pundits, who had once been eager to take Keanu down, were now quiet, unsure of how to proceed. The studio audience, once eager to see conflict unfold, was now on edge. It wasn't that they were afraid of what Keanu had said, it was that they had never seen someone so calmly and directly challenge everything they had been told to believe. Keanu's words were cutting through the noise, and the effect was palpable. Even the camera crew, usually so focused on capturing the perfect shot, seemed to be caught up in the moment, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. The host, struggling to maintain his composure, tried to steer the conversation back on course. So, you're saying that the problems we face aren't political? That the issues we're dealing with aren't about right versus left, red versus blue? His voice was almost pleading now, desperate for Keanu to fall back into the narrative they had created for him. Keanu sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered the host's words. No, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm saying that the issues we face go beyond politics. They're about people. They're about the way we treat each other, the way we let systems of power decide who gets to have a voice and who doesn't. You think the world is divided because of politics? No. It's divided because we've allowed it to be. We've allowed the narrative to be shaped by people who don't care about the consequences of their words, their actions, or the lives they affect. The host looked momentarily speechless, the weight of Keanu's words crashing down on him. It was as though he had been knocked off balance, unable to recover the momentum he had once controlled so easily. The conservative pundit, The one who had tried to trap Keanu in his earlier remarks now looked like he didn't know whether to speak or remain silent, as though he was trying to process everything he had just heard. His usual smugness had vanished, replaced by a deep discomfort. Keanu turned to the audience, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "You know," he continued, "I've been on this journey for a long time. I've made mistakes. I've said things I regret, and I've done things that weren't always in line with my values. But that's the point. We're all human. We all make choices, and we all have the power to change. What matters isn't what side you're on, it's what you do with the power you have. The real change comes when we stop waiting for someone else to tell us what's right and wrong, and we start asking ourselves what we can do to make things better." For a moment, the entire room seemed suspended in time, caught in the weight of what Keanu had just said. The host, the pundits, the audience, all of them seemed to be struggling with a truth they hadn't expected to hear. And in that silence, Keanu's presence felt larger than ever, not because of his celebrity, but because of the honesty that had poured from him. He wasn't here to please anyone. He wasn't here to be a pawn in their political game. He was here to speak truth, regardless of the consequences. The host finally managed to break the silence, but his words were halting, almost unsure of themselves. "So, you're saying we need to change the system? But how do we do that, Keanu? How do we fix what's broken?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "You start by changing the way you think," he said, his voice resolute. "You stop seeing people as problems to be solved and start seeing them as people who deserve respect, compassion, and a fair shot at a better life. You stop worrying about who's winning the argument and start worrying about who's being left behind." And just like that, Keanu had turned the entire conversation upside down. The host, the pundits, and the audience, none of them were sure what to do anymore. Keanu had stripped away the layers of divisiveness, the superficial arguments, and forced them to confront something far more profound, the way they viewed each other and the world around them. It wasn't about politics. It was about humanity. And for the first time in a long time, the people in that room had no idea how to respond. The silence that followed Keanu's words was suffocating. The room, once alive with the sounds of bickering pundits and the host's attempts to direct the conversation, had gone still. The audience, who had expected a fiery conclusion, now sat frozen, unsure of what to make of the man before them. Keanu had done something that no one had anticipated. He had dismantled the very structure of the show, not through aggressive debate, but with quiet, forceful clarity. The host, who had prided himself on controlling the narrative, suddenly found himself out of his depth, his words trailing off without any sense of authority. He shifted in his chair, clearing his throat awkwardly, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Well, that's one perspective, Keanu," he said, his voice sounding hollow, almost as if he were struggling to hold on to the familiar role he had occupied for so long. "But at the end of the day, people are going to pick sides. That's how politics works. That's how the world works. You can't just opt out and expect everything to magically improve. It doesn't work like that." Keanu sat there, unmoved, his eyes steady as he regarded the host. There was no trace of frustration in his expression, no sign of anger. Instead, there was only calm, a quiet understanding that seemed to stretch across the entire studio. "I never said you should opt out. What I'm saying is, there's more than one way to engage with the world," Keanu replied, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be part of the same polarized game. You don't have to let the system decide what's right for you, or how you should think, or who you should agree with." The host, visibly rattled now, opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had expected Keanu to stumble, to fall into the trap he had set, but instead, he had witnessed something far more disorienting. It wasn't just the power of Keanu's celebrity that had made his words effective, it was the conviction, the quiet strength with which he spoke. The host, who had spent years honing his skills in the art of debate and control, now found himself unable to respond, unsure of how to counter an argument that didn't rely on the same tired strategies he had used countless times. Keanu's gaze drifted across the panel now, his eyes briefly meeting those of the conservative pundit who had attempted to challenge him earlier. The man's expression had shifted. The smugness, which had been so evident at the beginning of the show, was gone, replaced by something resembling reflection. He no longer seemed so sure of himself, no longer so certain that he had been in the right. Keanu, sensing the shift, leaned forward slightly. "You don't need to agree with me," he said, his voice steady. "But maybe you could start by listening, really listening. Start by asking yourself why you believe what you believe, and whether it's truly your own thought, or if it's something someone else has told you to think." The conservative pundit, who had been poised to argue further, hesitated. His face reddened as if he were grappling with something deep inside himself. He opened his mouth but closed it again, unsure of how to respond. Keanu wasn't offering him an enemy, an opponent to defeat. He was offering him an invitation to question, to reconsider, to examine his own beliefs. And that was something none of them had expected. For a moment, the entire room seemed to be holding its breath, caught in the web of Keanu's quiet challenge. The host, desperate to keep the show moving, tried again to regain control. "I think it's clear," then he said, his voice shaky, "that Keanu's views are a bit different from the mainstream. But let's move on, shall we? We've spent enough time on this. Let's talk about something else, something less uncomfortable?" Keanu interrupted, his voice sharp now, but still calm. "Less challenging? Is that what you want? Something that doesn't make you think too much? Something that keeps you safe in the world you've built for yourself?" The host faltered, a mix of embarrassment and frustration flashing across his face. Keanu's words had cut deeper than he had anticipated, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his own hypocrisy. His usual deflections, his practiced techniques of steering the conversation, had failed him. What was supposed to be a spectacle had turned into a quiet reckoning, one that he wasn't sure how to navigate. Keanu hadn't yelled, hadn't raised his voice, but he had managed to expose the cracks in the facade the host had worked so hard to create. The studio audience, which had been silent for what felt like an eternity, finally reacted. It wasn't the applause they had expected, nor the loud cheers or boos that usually followed such confrontations. Instead, there was a murmur, a low hum of conversation as people turned to one another, their faces reflecting the same confusion, the same quiet thoughtfulness that had overtaken the pundits. Keanu had forced them all to confront something uncomfortable about themselves, something they hadn't been prepared for. They hadn't just watched a debate, they had witnessed an unspoken truth laid bare. The conservative pundit, his expression now uncertain, spoke up again, but his tone had shifted. It was softer, more reflective than before. I don't know if I agree with you, Keanu," he said, his voice lacking its earlier bite. "But maybe you're right. Maybe there is more to this than just picking sides." He shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the realization that he had been caught up in something much bigger than he had anticipated. Keanu nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift without fanfare. He wasn't interested in winning or losing the argument. He wasn't interested in being right or wrong. What mattered to him was the fact that, for just a moment, people had stopped to think. They had stopped to question what they had been told, what they had been taught, and perhaps most importantly, what they had chosen to believe about each other. That, to him, was the true victory. As the show began to wrap up, the host, still clearly rattled, tried to steer the conversation toward more superficial topics, but it was clear that the energy in the room had shifted. The pundits no longer seemed eager to engage in the usual back and forth, and the audience, while still uncertain, seemed to be taking in the moment with a new sense of awareness. The show would end, but the questions Keanu had raised would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. Keanu stood up to leave, his movements slow and deliberate. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand speeches. He simply walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of people who were, for once, not sure of what they had just witnessed. The show may have ended, but for everyone in that room, the real conversation was just beginning.